Imagine this, it's 1917. Villages burned, families scattered, leaders hunted. World War I is tearing Europe apart. Millions are dying in muddy trenches in France and Belgium. But thousands of kilometers away, in the misty green hills of Northeast India, another war is about to begin. A war you've probably never heard of. The Anglo-Kuki War. It wasn't fought for oil or colonies in Europe. It was fought for dignity and freedom. Yet, this chapter has almost vanished from our history books. This is the story the world forgot. The Anglo-Kuki War of 1917 to 1919. The Kukis are an indigenous hill tribe. They've lived in the rugged hills between present-day India and Myanmar for centuries. Fiercely independent, skilled hunters and warriors. They knew every river, every ridge, every hidden trail. When the British came in the late 19th century, they took over Assam, Manipur, and Burma. But the Kukis, they weren't easy to control. Their villages were scattered. Their chiefs ruled their own affairs. So, for years, the British mostly left them alone. But the world changed in 1917. The Great War, what we now call World War I, had already turned into a bloodbath, and far away from the battlefields, the British were looking for manpower. They saw the hill tribes not just as warriors, but as a workforce. That decision would change the Kukis' history forever. World War I was eating up soldiers faster than they could be replaced. The British were desperate, so they created something called the Labor Corps. The job wasn't to fight. It was to dig trenches, carry supplies, build roads, often in freezing, dangerous conditions in Europe. They start recruiting hills tribesmen from different parts of Manipur, Assam, and other parts of the country. But when the British officers came to the Kuki chiefs, demanding young men for the corps, the chiefs refused. They boldly told the British officers they had no reason to send their sons halfway across the world, to risk death for a war that wasn't theirs. The British, however, didn't like that answer. They began trying to force recruitment. Police patrols entered villages. Threats were made. Some young men were taken by force. And this is where the British make their biggest mistake, because instead of breaking the Kukis, it united them. For the first time, dozens of Kuki clans came together. Chiefs who once fought each other now sat in the same council. Names like Tintong Haukip, Chengjapao Dungel, and others became leaders of a new resistance. They planned their moves carefully. Colonial outposts were raided. Patrols were ambushed in the jungle. Supply lines were cut. British officers woke up to find their authority vanishing in the hills. This wasn't a one-off skirmish. By some estimates, over 100 villages joined the rebellion. The Kukis fought with whatever they had: spears, locally made guns, and knowledge of the land. Here's some of the tactics, strategies, or deceptive plan undertaken by the Kukis. After a hit, they would vanish into the thick forest, leaving the British chasing shadows. They would attack camps under the cover of darkness, using loud war cries and drums to cause chaos, set traps in narrow jungle trails and steep mountain passes where British troops had no room to maneuver. They create false paths to lure enemy columns into dead ends or swampy ground. In one shocking move, Kuki warriors bound massive rocks at mountain tops, and when British troops marched below, the rocks were then unleashed, crushing soldiers in a thunderous avalanche. They would also light up multiple campfires, or setting up dummy warriors to make the British believe they were surrounded by a much larger force. Sometimes they pretend to flee in panic, only to lead enemy troops straight into an ambush zone. For the Empire, this was becoming an expensive, embarrassing problem. and they weren't about to let it slide. The British shifted to full-scale military operations. They pulled in troops from Assam, Manipur, and Burma. They brought in heavier weapons and more men. But the hills fought for the Kukis. Dense forests, steep ridges, and narrow valleys meant the British couldn't move in large formations. Every step forward was risky. Every supply run was vulnerable. So the British changed tactics. They began burning villages suspected of helping rebels. They destroyed grain stores. They seized livestock. The goal wasn't just to defeat fighters. It was to starve entire communities into submission. The war dragged on. The British had the advantage of endless resources. The Kukis had the advantage of knowing every inch of the land. But as months turned into years, the pressure began to show. Crops failed. Ammunition ran low. Families were displaced. Still, the Kukis held out. This wasn't just resistance. It was survival. By 1919, after nearly 3 years of fighting, the rebellion began to crumble. One by one, Kuki chiefs surrendered. Some were captured. Others negotiated peace under harsh terms. Many leaders were imprisoned for years. Villages were fined. Some were forcibly relocated. On paper, the British had won, but the victory came at a cost. For the empire and for the Kukis. For the British, this was one of the longest and most resource-draining tribal uprisings in the region. For the Kukis, it was a reminder that they could unite when their way of life was threatened. So why don't we hear about this in our history books? Because history is often written by those in power. For the British, the Anglo-Kuki War was a messy, costly distraction during World War I. Not the kind of thing they wanted to brag about. And after independence, focus shifted to the freedom struggle in the mainland India. The Northeast's stories, especially tribal uprisings, rarely made it into the national narrative. But for the people who lived it, it's not just history. It's lived memory. For the Kukis, the Anglo-Kuki War is remembered as the Great Kuki Rebellion. It wasn't simply about refusing labor recruitment. It was about the right to decide their own fate. They stood up to one of the largest empires in history and said, "We will not be your subjects." And that's worth remembering, because history isn't just about who won. It's about who stood up.